We are almost through the sermon series on the fruit of the Spirit. And today's fruit is the fruit of goodness. I told you they're not in order of the way that Paul put them in Galatians 5, but I've tried to connect them with gospel lessons that the Revised Common Lectionary have given us. So today is a story from the Gospel of Mark, and we're going to be in the Gospel of Mark in the lectionary for quite a while here. This is how Mark begins, and it's this story about Jesus breaking some of the laws on the Sabbath, and then how he defends the position by reinterpreting the culture, the content of what they know about the tradition. And so here is the story from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 2, very beginning, verses 23 through chapter 3, verse 6. Jesus went through the wheat fields on the Sabbath. As the disciples made their way, they were picking heads of wheat. The Pharisees said to Jesus, "Look, why are they breaking the Sabbath law?" He said to them, "Haven't you ever read what David did when he was in need? When he and those with him were hungry? During the time when Abiathar was high priest, David went into God's house and ate the bread of the presence, which only the priests were allowed to eat. He also gave the bread to those who were with him." Then he said, "The Sabbath was created for humans. Humans weren't created for the Sabbath. That is why the human one is Lord, even over the Sabbath." Jesus returned to the synagogue. A man with a withered hand was there, wanting to bring charges against Jesus. They were watching him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. He said to the man with the withered hand, "Step up where people can see you." Then he said to them, "Is it legal on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil? To save life or to kill?" But they said nothing. Looking around at them with anger, deeply grieved at their unyielding hearts, he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." So he did, and his hand was made healthy. At that, the Pharisees got together with supporters of Herod to plan how to destroy Jesus. The Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ. Thanks be to God. Chapter 3. In chapter 3 of Luke, there's a genealogy of Jesus' birth. In chapter 3 of John, he's got that conversation with Nicodemus about being reborn. Chapter 3 of Matthew, we're still at the beginning because, of course, Luke and Matthew both have nativity birth stories. But in chapter 3 of Mark, his eventual arrest and crucifixion is already being planned. For Mark, he wants to get to the end right away. He wants to tell you why this is so significant and that all the things that Jesus is doing is really what's going to cause him to eventually be killed. Two things about this. Let's look at the quote-unquote bad guys in this scenario. Pharisaic Judaism was the precursor to rabbinical Judaism, which is what we were probably most familiar with. So don't dog the Pharisees just yet. They weren't all bad. They were just trying to do their jobs. Their job is interpreting the law for the people. Say, okay, this is what God said we ought to do. I mean, this is in the Big Ten, right? Honor the Sabbath. And we're just trying to figure out, like, you must be somebody, because obviously the Pharisees were there and witnessed these two things because they were in the crowds that followed Jesus. My next sermon series is going to be entitled The Crowds and Jesus, because this is kind of like who was around all the time. Who was in the crowd? What did they say? What did they learn? So the Pharisees, the quote-unquote bad guys in here, they're authority figures, but they're following him because they're interested in what's happening. They're just trying to do their jobs, interpreting the law so that people could live well as God had intended. God intended for good for the people by giving the law. That's what the point of it is, so you stay alive. You can't eat shellfish before refrigeration. It's bad for you. So, that's why it's there in the law, to keep people alive, to propagate, to have more people, to keep them safe and keep them on the path that would do the best for their lives, to give them, in a sense, parameters for better nutrition and all the rest that goes with it. Some of the Pharisees did not agree with Jesus, but certainly some of them did. I mentioned Nicodemus from the Gospel of John. Essentially, this is a great theme, this constant discourse about the law. So these Pharisees are going around and they're constantly debating the law. What does this mean? How do we live? So they're in this conversation with Jesus, who is a rabbi. We don't know exactly if he was considered a Pharisee or not, but he had a lot of contention with this group. And I'm sure like how every group, you can't really categorize all of them in one group. Maybe it was like a particular clique of Pharisees that really had it out for Jesus. Because certainly some of them did agree and were intrigued in his teachings because they're having this conversation. So Jesus stands up and participates in this Pharisaic Judaism tradition by reinterpreting the story about King David. And he's very intentional in this spot. He's engaging in the discourse. He is doing what they were doing when they said, you're not supposed to do this. You're not supposed to pick grain on the Sabbath, and you're not supposed to heal on the Sabbath. You're doing these things wrong. And essentially what he says in the temple when he brings the man forward is, well, is it important for us to do good on the Sabbath or do evil? Well, of course, there's an obvious answer there. It's goodness. We need to do the good. We need to do the good. Jesus is having them figure out what the good is. Is it legal on the Sabbath to do good or do evil, to save life or to kill? And Jesus, at that point, is so radical for them that they start hatching a plot and enlist Herod to get the rolling. But Jesus is so radical that even we have lost him. He's become, for a lot of us, in our minds, a novelty rather than something that is essential for our lives. And friends, when the novelty wears off, people leave. It's not Jesus. It's not the gospel. It's not his ministry. It's not the message. It's the marketing. The challenge is the way the institution or the body that was entrusted to do the marketing has done the marketing. We haven't sold Jesus to the population the right way. Because Jesus is so much more than what the church in North America has promoted him as. And I think, well, obviously it's never too late because it's really not in our hands. It's God's power. It's the message that has sustained, even when all Christians were underground, the message carried on. Even when Christians act in such a way during the Crusades, killing people in the name of Jesus, it survived. Through renovations and reformations and all of the rest, the gospel has survived. So even though the institutional church in North America has done its darndest to keep the message weird and strange and novelty and just so far away from the actual Jesus that we read about in the gospel, even though that's happened, the gospel will survive. And the church with the little c, the one that Jesus planted in the world, will survive. But for now, the church is failing. People don't really want to do it anymore. It's not interesting to them. The new generations don't even have a vernacular for it. And I'm talking from X on. Xers are now in their 50s. So think about that. Generation after generation never saw bread broken, never set foot in a sanctuary, even for a wedding or a funeral, because the church has promoted Jesus in the wrong way. Has stuck him in a point of time in history as a novelty item that, wore off. Not interesting anymore. And that's what happens when you make Jesus into a Chia Pet. Do you not have the slide of the Chia Pet? Anyway, I found one that they made with a cross. Do you know what a Chia Pet is? Yes. You heard of this, right? Yeah. It's old. It's from the 80s. It's from the time of rotary dial telephones.
They still make them.
But everybody had to have one. Everybody had to have one. A cute novelty item. You had to have one. TV commercials. Remember the little jingle? I'm not going to sing it. So that it gets in your head and it'll never go back out. But they went out of style, didn't they? Like everything does. Because they're a fad thing. They're a novelty item. They're not essential. They were all the rage until they weren't.
They make them the same way they make novelty cereal.
But does this sound familiar, that it's gone out of style? It's not a thing? Well, let me tell you something about a Chia Pet. They got it all wrong. Because the chia seed itself is amazing. Not the brown ones that you put into a paste and you stick on the back of pottery to make Bob Ross's hair grow green. But the actual chia seed that one human could consume. It's a superfood, folks. It has protein and nutrients and fiber and essential, all kinds of things. That list is really, really long when it comes to chia seeds. Do you guys know about this? Are you familiar with it these days? They put it in smoothies. You can make this pudding out of it. It is a superfood. For some reason, though, and they've known this for centuries about the value of the chia seeds and how good they are for health. But for some reason in the 80s, we didn't need it. We used it for craft and decorative purposes. See, they wanted to sell you chia seeds, but instead of sharing that they were really good for you and that you should ingest the ones that are fully ripe, they made this joke, this novelty item. It's not the chia's fault. The seeds remain this source of nutrition. They've always been good for centuries. They're really in fashion now, but that's a good thing because now we know we have to ingest them. We don't need to put them on a shelf over here and see if they grow something weird. I mean, they're cute, I guess, but they're really better if you eat them because they're good for you. I don't know if you see where I'm going with this. It's not the chia seed's fault. The chia is the same. It's how you market it. It's what you do with the seeds. The seeds remain a source of nutrition and goodness. There's nothing wrong with Chia Pets. They're cute. They are funny. They are a great gag gift. But they are not the only value or use for chia seeds. These things are so much more. I eat them now all the time for fiber and protein, antioxidants. You need all this stuff. They have vitamins. It seems like such a waste to put them into a paste on the back of a porcelain porcupine. The pets got the people to buy chia seeds, but for the wrong purposes. If you don't eat them for health, eventually you're going to get tired of the chia pets and throw them out, and they won't be of value to your life. And I really think this is what we have done in the church with the gospel. Jesus even refers to his message in parables as seeds. We have Jesus. We have the Bible. But we are using them in the wrong way for novelty and nostalgia and to be put on a shelf and to be placed in a certain time in our culture. I think the scholars say it's 1956 would be the ideal. And it's not relevant to the people living today because it's not essential. It's a novelty on a shelf. We set it on a shelf. And we remember a time when it was really popular. And that's it. There's a guy in Philadelphia. He's a southern dude because he's got a heavy accent, but he lives in Philadelphia. His name is Shane Claiborne, and he really eats the chia. He literally makes farming and gardening equipment out of weapons. Like, he repurposes, melts them down, and makes trowels and hoes and shovels out of what was formerly a weapon. Just like what it says in the Bible, beating swords into plowshares. He's this guy who has this community called the Simple Way. He's committed to the poor. He's taken Jesus seriously, literally. By comparison, it makes the church experience of today look very self-serving to my eyes. What if we took our commitment to the poor off the shelf? What if we took our response to economic and racial injustice off the shelf and really lived it? What if we were truly committed to the way of Jesus, living a life of simplicity and the third way of nonviolence as a church? Well, some churches are arming themselves. Other churches or movements are disarming in order to make weapons of cultivation rather than violence. What if we did at least one more thing to make the world a little more like what God had intended? We would be standing on a better footing to justify our continuing existence as church. What if we ingested the chia instead of playing with it? What if Jesus is that essential nutrient instead of the most important character in a nostalgic novelty? The church needs to get on board with goodness, putting goodness into the world, doing good, regardless of what the higher-ups say about what needs to be done or what should be done, or how they couch it, or how the politicians can turn it and spin it a different way to make you feel afraid of it so that they can tell you that they're going to help you with it. What if we weren't afraid because we have Jesus? The church needs to get on board with goodness. We need to start eating the chia rather than putting it on the shelf and using it for decorations. The goodness of the gospel only works when we imbibe it, when we take it into ourselves, when we live it out, when we let it order our steps. When we apply Jesus' example and ministry to our lives. I mean, he took risks. And that's the main thing that keeps us from doing those kind of things. We don't want to be risky. We don't want to offend anybody, step on anybody's toes. And we don't want to put ourselves out there. I mean, after all, didn't end very well for Jesus. But what if the church became a place of true goodness, of spiritual health for the mind, the body, and the soul, instead of adding memberships and entertaining increasingly smaller and smaller groups of people for 1 hour on Sunday morning? What if we ate the chia seeds instead? Like the Pharisees in the gospel lesson, we often get the priorities reversed. It doesn't exist for us to feel nostalgic. It doesn't exist for us to look at beauty and be entertained. It exists for a fundamental reason that God intended for this world to be whole and healthy and have hope, and it meant all of us. Not just the ones here, not just me and my family, all of us. The ones who wash the dishes, the ones who serve, the ones who clean the hotel rooms, the ones who order around people in some corporate office somewhere, the ones who are cleaning up hospital rooms, the ones who are doing intricate surgeries. All of us matter and need to be included. And instead of worrying about what we're told to worry about by the culture out there, how about we give our decisions in life, like Jesus does, a goodness test? Well, this is going to happen on the Sabbath, whether you like it or not. Is it good for me to do good, or is it okay for me to do evil? To save life or to kill? Why don't we give all of our decisions the goodness test? Where is the goodness in this decision? Will this promote goodness in the world? Will this be a way of following Jesus? Am I ingesting the nutrients of this gospel, or am I just making this decision as a self-serving way to get on with it and ignore the things I don't want to concern me? Because when we do the goodness test, like Jesus did that day, that's how we move forward as a people. A people who, by the church, empowered by the Holy Spirit, might truly live the way of Jesus. And so this morning, we are going to consume, imbibe, take into ourselves that essential nutrient. The bread and the cup represent something that has spiritual significance for us. And it's not to be taken lightly. When we take this into ourselves, we are making a promise to God to walk in this way, to understand the value of what this gospel has for us. We take and we consume the bread and the cup because we understand that's what we need to live. We don't put a picture of bread and cup on a wall and gaze upon it. We take it into ourselves. We actively participate in this holy communion, at one with God, at one with the saints who have gone before us, at one with one another here and everywhere. It's time to eat the chia. It's time to consume the goodness of the world that's been planted and given for us. It's time to understand what is good, and it's time to stop trying to sell it in another form. You need this to survive. Doesn't matter if it's cute.